Hello everyone. So this is your biology video on your third unit, biological classification. So before going into the topic, let me introduce the subtopics inside the biological classification lesson, and then I will start explaining about each of the topics. So first, the name of your lesson is biological classification. So the topics that we are going to cover in this is, so you will be learning about what is biodiversity and how are the classification has been made. In your previous classes you would have learnt about the classification and what are the criteria used for classification and all those things. So how this classification started, what is the base of the classification, about that you are going to see, and the three types of classification, that is the artificial system of classification. So what are the criteria that are included under artificial system of classification, we will be seeing. Then after that, natural system of classification, under that what are the criteria included, and finally phylogenetic classification. So what are the criteria included under phylogenetic classification. So the three types of classification we are going to discuss, and the purpose of classification, why we are classifying all the organisms. So that you will be seeing. And after that, about biodiversity. So what is the term biodiversity mean? So in a detailed manner you will be learning. And finally, the hierarchy of classification, that is how the organism is being classified. So from this beginning we were talking about the types of classification, the purpose. In this hierarchy you will know that how the organisms are classified, in what terms they are being placed. So how from the what is the lower level of any organism to the higher level of any organism. So that you will be knowing. The hierarchy is the order of how the organism is being placed. So all these things you will be learning in this video. So let me start the session now.
So what is flora and fauna? So flora means plants, fauna means animals. So all the plants come under flora and all the animals come under fauna. So in the whole world, if you take, means 1 million species of animals are present. So think how many numbers of animals are present on here. 1 million species of animals and 500,000 species of known plants. Only these are the number of species that have been identified. So there are a lot number of species that are not identified. So 1 million species of animals are there on earth and 500,000 species of known plants are there on the earth. Living organisms vary considerably in their form, structure and mode of cycle. So all the organisms are very different. Each and every organism vary in their form, how the external body structure. In that way also each organism is different. For example, take a plant and a human being. On the external structure, are there any similarities? No, but all are organisms, they differ. Likewise, each organism, each species of organism differs. So all the organisms vary considerably in their form and their external structure and the mode of cycle, how they function. So we will be working on the daytime and sleeping in the night, whereas owl will be awake in the night time. So the mode of cycle itself is totally different. Likewise, each organism has different mode of cycle, so that also varies. So you should imagine how many number of species are there on the earth and how they differ. Each of them differ in structure, form, structure and mode of cycle. So every organism is unique. All the organisms are unique, and uniqueness is due to diversity in life forms. So why each organism is unique? Because of diversity. So difference. Since all the organisms are different, that is why they are unique. They have a special feature. So the uniqueness is due to diversity in life forms. Since the life forms are very different, there are a number, billions of species. So that is why each organism is unique. And flora, what did I tell you? Flora means plants. And fauna, fauna means animals. So flora and fauna of forests, mountains, deserts, etc. are still unexplored to a large extent. So what they are telling? The plants and the animals of the forest, the plants and animals that are present in the forest, mountains, deserts are being still unexplored. Like I already told you, this is only the known number of species on the earth. So there are a huge number of species that are not even known. It is not even identified still. So there are many organisms in forests, in mountains, because these are the places many organisms will be there. In deserts also there are few organisms that are not being identified. Both plants and animals, there are some organisms that are still being unexplored to a large extent. So a large number of organisms are there that are not still being identified. And diversity of plants and animals should be studied properly using some kind of classification. So what they are telling, the diversity, the difference of each of the organisms should be learned. We cannot learn it one by one. So some classification should be there, some method should be there. Using that classification, we should be able to learn all the organisms. It is impossible to study all the organisms separately. So for this purpose only, we are using the classification. Why? Because there are millions and millions of organisms in the earth. So there are many number of plants, there are many number of animals. We cannot learn them one by one. So for that purpose, to avoid that difficulty only, we are using the classification. Many kinds of classification are there. So we are using the classification technique and learning all the organisms, grouping all the organisms under each group, and we are learning them together. So that is the main purpose of classification. Then only we can study them properly. And zoologists and botanists classify many organisms based on similarities and differences in organisms. So zoologists means who study about animals. Botanists means people who study about plants. So zoologists and botanists, what they did, they classified many organisms based on similarities. The same organisms are put under one group. Differences mean different organisms are put in different groups. So what they did, they classified the organisms based on similarities of organisms with one another, and differences. What is the difference between this group and this group? So based on that also, they classified the organisms. So these are the two main criteria of how the organisms are being classified. So this is all about diversity and classification. Now I will give you a short recap from the first. This in the lesson biological classification, we saw what is flora. Flora means plants, fauna means animals. There are 1 million species of animals present on the earth. That is only the known number. And 500,000 species of known plants are there on the earth. And living organisms vary considerably in their form, structure and mode of cycle. So all the organisms differ from one another in form, structure and mode of cycle and every organism is unique. All the organisms are unique. So this uniqueness is due to diversity in life form. So why they are unique? Because due to diversity, there are different types of organisms. That is why it's called as diversity. Since there are many kinds of organisms, life forms are there. So uniqueness is due to diversity in life forms. And flora means plants, fauna means animals. So the flora and fauna of the forest, the mountains and deserts are still unexplored to a large extent. Many plants and animals are in mountains, forests and deserts are still unexplored to a very large extent. And diversity of plants and animals should be studied properly using some kind of classification. So all the organisms should be studied properly using some kind of classification. To know the diversity of organisms, we should classify the organisms and learn them. So classification is very important, and it is impossible to study all the organisms separately. So there are millions of organisms are there. We cannot learn them separately. So a classification should be there to learn all the organisms properly. And finally, zoologists, people who study about animals, and botanists, people who study about plants, classify many organisms based on similarities and differences in organisms. So zoologists and botanists, what they did, they classified all the organisms based on the similarities of organisms, and they are put into one group, and those groups were compared with one another to know the differences in the organisms. We were seeing about the importance of classification, why classification is needed, and about how many organisms are there, what is the main need of classification, how the organisms are unique. So those are the things we saw now. And next is, we are going to see the different types of classification. So first, the system of grouping of living forms based on similarities and differences is called classification. So what is classification? Classification is nothing but grouping of organisms. All the organisms we are grouping based on similarities. If there are any similarities in structure, function, they will be put under one group. And this is one classification. And comparing them their differences and putting them in different groups. So comparing all the organisms based on their similarities and differences, they are grouped, and that is what is called as classification. And the branch of biology concerned with classification is called taxonomy. So this is a branch of biology that is related to classification is called taxonomy. So taxonomy deals everything about classification alone. So in taxonomy only, how the organism is being identified, how the naming is given to the organism, and how it is being classified according to the groups. So all these things are studied in taxonomy. So people who are related to the classification of organisms, people who are classifying all the organisms, they are called as taxonomists. So the study of classification is called as taxonomy. And we are going to see the different types of classification now. First, what are the basics of classification? First, in the early, at the starting stage of classification, that is the classification period was started. During that, organisms was made by they were classified by Greek thinkers. So Aristotle, Theophrastus and Pliny the Elder. Aristotle, Theophrastus, Pliny the Elder. elder. So these were the three people who made early attempts on classification of organisms. That is, we cannot learn all the organisms individually. They should be grouped according to some characters. So that was realized by the Greek thinkers of it. They were the ones who first started classifying the organisms. So who are those persons? Aristotle, Theophrastus and Pliny the Elder. So these were the Greek thinkers who started the classification. And next is the artificial classification. So artificial classification is one method. So early biologists, the biologists who were in the before period used habits and habitats as the basis of classification. So what these biologists did, they took the habits, how they eat, how they behave, those habits and the places where they live. That is only called as habitats. So they took only these two criteria and they classified all the organisms. So in the starting stage, all the external structure and the internal function, the color and all was not considered. Only two criteria, that is habits and habitats. The habits that the animals or the plants behave and the habitats where they live. So these were the two criteria for the classification. And Aristotle, he classified animals according to whether they live on land, water or air. So what Aristotle did, he classified all the organisms based on whether they live on land. They were put under one group. All the organisms that live on land were put under one group, and water living organisms were put under one group, and those who live in the air that can fly, those were put under one group. So like this only Aristotle, he classified the organisms in the starting stage. Now I will give you a short recap from the first. We saw the definition of classification, the system of grouping of living forms based on similarities and differences. Grouping of animals based on similarities and differences is called classification, and the branch of biology concerned with classification is called as taxonomy. So taxonomy means it is the branch of biology that deals with classification. That is, what are the steps of classification? Naming them, identifying them, classifying them, giving names according to the accepted principles. So those were all coming under this taxonomy only. It is a branch of study. And next is, we saw the classification of living organisms. What are the basics of living organisms? In the early attempts, in the early period, classifying organisms was made by Greek thinkers Aristotle, Theophrastus, Pliny the Elder. So these three were the people who first early attempted on classifying the organisms. Aristotle, Theophrastus and Pliny the Elder. And we are moving on to the first type of classification, that is artificial classification. So in early biologists, they used habits and habitats as the basis of classification. So all these early biologists who were living in the past period, they took the habits of the organisms and habitats of the organisms and they made the classification. So Aristotle classified animals according to whether they live on land, water or in air. So on what basis did he classify Aristotle? He classified according to the organisms whether they live in land. They were put under one group. The water living organisms were put under one group. And those which can fly and live in air, they were put under one group. Like this only, he made the classification first. We were discussing about the artificial classification. So the definition for that is the system of classification which is based on one or few arbitrarily chosen criteria such as habitat or one or more major habits of organism is called artificial classification. So the system of classification. So artificial system is a system of classification. It is based on one of your chosen. Not all the criteria. They are choosing only one or few characters only for that organism. So what is that one of few organism is? Habitat. That is where the organism live. So based on that only artificial classification is made. That is one criteria or one or more major habits, or taking not only habitats, they are taking the habits of the organism, how the organism behaves. So one or more characters of the habits also is taken. So this is called artificial classification. So what they tell, artificial classification, it is the system of classification. It is based on one or two chosen criteria, that is characteristics. So what are the criteria is? One is habitat and another criteria is one or more major habits of the organism. So that is only is called as artificial classification. And next we are going to see the disadvantages. What are the disadvantages of artificial classification? So one or few criteria are simple and misleading. So we saw here they are taking the habits as one criteria and some criteria related to habits and on habitats also. These are both two main criteria. They are taken as basis. But those criteria, what I tell is, it is very simple and it can mislead. So it is not properly classified. It can mislead to some other thing. So like that they are telling. That is the first disadvantage. And the major drawback is it did not reflect natural relationship among organisms. So the artificial classification, they did not relate to the organisms. So they in the land, if the organism, all the organisms are put under one group, in the land itself there are many different organisms totally unrelated. So with the habitats alone we cannot classify the organisms. There are some characters that should also be included, and based on that the classification has to be made. So that is what is said here. It is very simple and it can mislead. That is like I already told you, if they are taking land organism means, and land itself they are worm-like structures, there are human beings, there are carnivores, there are herbivores, there are so where does all these characters go? So those are all should also be considered, right? So for that only they are telling it may mislead. So based on the habitats, the classification should not be made, and there is no natural relationship. That is, all the organisms are blended to one another. So we depend on plants or animals. So those depend on smaller animals or plants. So there is a cycle or there is a relationship, natural relationship. So that is also not included in this classification because we are seeing only the habitats and habits alone. So it does not give any natural relationship of the organism. So that is not reflected in artificial classification. The major drawback is it did not reflect natural relationship among organisms. And different types of organisms are grouped together. So those which are not related, they are totally different. So such organisms are grouped under one group. So for example, flying animals, insects and bats, they are put under one group. So flying and insects are different. They also sometimes fly. Insects are totally different. Bats, they are another different. Since they are flying, they cannot be put under one roof. So we know the habits of the insects, right? So the shape and size of the insects and habits of the insects, they are totally different. Whereas bats, if you see, means they are nocturnal. That is they will sleep in the morning and they are awake on the night. They can see in the night time. So the characteristics itself, it is totally different. But what happens is, in artificial classification, these organisms are put under one group. Different organisms are grouped under one group. Example, flying animals like insects and bats. Next is wild related organisms such as bat, whale and rat. They are separated. So closely related animals, they are being put under different groups because why? Only the habitats, the place where they live. So that is the only thing that we are taking. So what happens? They are being separated. That is, what is the similarity in these animals is bat is a mammal. It is a flying mammal. So mammal means those animals that gives rise to the young ones. They will look after the young ones. They do not lay eggs. So those are called as mammals. So bat is a flying mammal and whale is an aquatic mammal and rat is also a land mammal. So these three are mammals since they are in different places. Since their habitats are the land, aquatic and flying, they are put under different groups. But all the three are mammals, but they are separated. So different animals are put in one group and similar animals are put in different groups. So these are another two disadvantages of artificial classification. So now you know an idea about artificial classification, on what basis they are being classified and what are the disadvantages of those classification. The next type is natural classification. So this type of classification involves categorization of living organism into broad groups, that is divisions, on the basis of large number of characters, that is similarities and dissimilarities. So what they are telling you is that natural classification, all the organisms are classified based on many characteristics. So not only habits and habitats, now they are evolved from the artificial classification and now they are taking many characters and put together to classify the organisms. So mainly they based on similarities. Same organisms are put under one group and dissimilar ones are put in different groups. So the system of classification, so natural system of classification, it involves categorization, grouping of living organism into broad groups. That is, they have made broad, wider groups, divisions. Those are called as divisions. So they are making divisions of organisms based on a large number of characters. So those are similarities and dissimilarities of the organism. So this I will continue about natural classification in the next board. Now I will give you a short recap from the first. We saw the definition for artificial classification, the system of classification which is based on one or few arbitrarily chosen criteria. One or two chosen criteria are taken. They are such as habitat or one or more major habits of organism is called artificial classification. So this is the definition for artificial classification. Then we discussed about the disadvantages of artificial classification. One or few criteria, they are simple and they sometimes misleading. And the major drawback is it did not reflect the natural relationship. That is, each organism is dependent on one another. So that is not reflected in this artificial classification among organisms. And different types of organisms, they are grouped together. For example, flying animals like insects and bats, they are put together. So morphologically they are totally different, but here they have put together. While related animals, all the related animals, they are separated. For example, bat is a flying mammal, and whale is an aquatic mammal, and rat is a land mammal. So these all the types of mammals are separated in each group because they are based only on the habitats of the organism. So these are the disadvantages of artificial classification. Then we are moving on to the next type of classification, that is natural classification. So it is a system of classification, involves categorization, grouping of living organisms into broad groups. That is, they are making a wider groups, that is, it is called as divisions on the basis of large number of characters. Here many number of characters are taken, and based on that all the organisms are classified. So based on the similarities and dissimilarities, all the organisms are classified. So this is all about natural classification. The next type of classification is phylogenetic classification. So first we saw artificial classification, which is based on habits and habitats. Then we saw natural classification. They took many characters and classified all the organisms. And next is the phylogenetic classification. This is the third type of classification. So here what they did is, they divided all the organisms based on lower organism and higher organisms. So later on I will explain you why these organisms are called as lower organism and why some organs are called as higher organism. But phylogenetic classification means you should remember that all the classification is made based on the lower organism and higher organisms. All the organisms were taken together, and some organisms were considered as lower organism and some were considered as higher organism. The concept of evolution shows that organisms keeps changing. So what they are telling, in evolution what happens? The organisms are being changed. So evolution means what? How an organism first originated, then evolution takes hundreds of years. So slowly changes will happen inside the organism, and they will change according to the needs of the environment, and finally they develop. So for example, evolution, we can take human being, that is the main example. So in that we have originated from monkeys. From monkeys it took hundreds of years to slowly change according to the environmental condition and finally developed into a human being. Likewise for giraffe, if we take animals, the neck of the giraffe was very short. Then later on what it does, it jumped to eat the leaves every day, and slowly the change takes place, and finally now the giraffe has a very tall neck. So like this only the evaluation takes place. So evolution means changes taking place slowly. It will take hundreds of years to suit to the environment. So here the concept of evolution, what happens? The organisms keeps changing. So from the monkey to human being, that also many stages of that, the organism keeps changing. It is same for the giraffe also. So that also slowly keeps changing. So evolution means organisms keeps changing. come. So some organisms without change and they are primitive, and some organisms they are recently changed. So for that, organisms belonging to the first group, that is organisms which do not have any change, they are called primitive or lower organisms. So those are organisms which do not have any change from the early period itself. So they are called as primitive or lower organism. And the second group is known as advanced or higher organism. The second group means the body design was recently evolved. They have been recently formed. So they are called as advanced or higher organism. Advanced or higher organism. So from this you know how the organism have been grouped as lower organism and higher organism. If the body design remains the same and it is primitive, it is known as primitive or lower organism. If they have recently evolved the body design, then it is called advanced or higher organism. The primitive groups are simple and advanced group is complex. So you can compare the body designs with the machines. So in those days, before days and all, they would have created some machines. So for example, you can tell printers you can take. So in the early period, it was very simple. The keys were there and we have to print and take the printer. But nowadays what happens? We type in the keyboard, it is shown in the monitor, a printer is there. We can take very clean copies. When comparing both the printed sheets, the print that is taken from the printer nowadays, it is being better than the hand typed ones. So in printer, in the old printers, if we make any mistake, what happens? We cannot correct it. But whereas nowadays, if we type in computers, we can correct the mistakes and take out the print. So this is advanced. So this latest printer, it is advanced and that is primitive. No changes, big changes are there. It is very simple. Whereas this is very complex. A keyboard is there that is connected to the monitor, and finally a printer is there. We can take print. Many machines are there. They are all interconnected. So this is very complex. Here it is very simple. So that you can have an example and learn that. So the primitive organs. So the organs will be very simple because it was produced in those days. In olden days itself it was there. So it is very simple. Whereas advanced organs, they will have very complex organs and body design. The evolutionary history of species is considered as the main criteria in the phylogenetic classification. So what happens? The evolution in phylogenetic classification, if an organism is taken, they are considering the whole evolutionary history. That is how the organism has evolved, how it all started and how it finally changed into this organism. Whether it is a lower organism or higher organism, whether any bodily changes have evolved recently, or does it remain the same in the past itself. So based on that only, the phylogenetic classification is made. So the evolutionary history of species is very important in phylogenetic classification. And the system of classification is based on evolutionary relationship and are known as phylogenetic classification. So that system of classification which is based on only the evolutionary relationship, they are known as phylogenetic classification. The system of classification that is based on the evolutionary relationship alone, that is how the organism has evolved, that is known as phylogenetic classification. So we have learned about phylogenetic classification in this book. Now I I will give you a short recap from the first. So we saw about phylogenetic classification. Phylogenetic classification means it is all about lower organism and higher organism. The concept of evolution that shows organisms keep changing. So in evolution, what happens? The organisms keeps changing. So some group of organisms, the body designs remains the same for a long period, whereas in some organisms, the designs are recently evolved. So the first group where the organism has the body design for a longer period without any change, that is called as primitive or lower organism. And next is the second group is the organism which has evolved recently, that is called as advanced or higher organism. The body design of the primitive groups, they will be very simple, and the advanced group will have complex body design. And the next is based on evolutionary history of species, how the organism has come to earth, what are the changes taking place in all these years. So that evolutionary history is taken, and based on that only phylogenetic classification is made. And the system of classification that is based on evolutionary relationship, that is known as phylogenetic classification. So that is the only they are taking the evolutionary history and relationship. Based on that only phylogenetic classification is made. So this is all about phylogenetic classification. We saw about what is classification first, and the three types of classification, that is natural, artificial and phylogenetic classification. Now the third next is we are going to see the purpose of classification. So why is classification made? What are the uses of classification? Why so many types of classification are there? So that we are going to see now. So purpose of classification. It makes the study of wide variety of organisms. We cannot learn each and every organism individually. It is very difficult. So to avoid such situation, classification is brought out. So when they are classified or grouped according to their characters, we can learn many varieties of organisms. So for that, classification is needed. Then next is it helps in understanding the phylogeny of organisms. So we can know the evolutionary history, like in phylogenetic classification, how the whole history of the classification, in that classification, the whole history of the organism is taken, and based on that they are classified. So when we learn according to that classification, we can learn all the evolutionary history of that organism. So we can know the phylogeny of that organism when we use the classification. It provides knowledge about the origin and genetic relationship among organisms. So classification, it gives knowledge on the origin, how the organism first originated, and what are the genetic relationship. So does it have some other organism's character, or it is due to some other environmental conditions. So what are the changes genetically, whether they have some bird's character or reptile's character. So what are the things that are present inside, that is genetically also we can see the genetic relationship and how it first originated, what was the form of the organism. So with that we can get the information, and classification supplies vital information to all the branches of biology. So classification, it gives many important information to all the branches of biology. That is, branches means if we are classifying the plants, it can be used in botany, and in evolutionary about ecology it can be used. Likewise for animals it can be used in zoology, and we can use in animal physiology. how the body works. That is, we are taking all the things under and classifying, right? So in a classification, all the information about the organism will be given. So it can be used for many branches of biology. And next is, by studying single animal or plant or group, classification provides general information about all the organisms. So a classification, we can learn about a single animal also we get information, or about any single plant also we get the information, or we can learn them as group also. So all these three things are possible in classification. So these are the purpose of classification. Some benefits also, benefits of classification, you can say like that also. So why classification is made, and what are the different uses of classification. The next topic is biodiversity. So this is not a new term to you. You have already learned in your lower classes itself. So biodiversity means diversity of life forms. So biodiversity means the different, if you take the earth, you can imagine how many different organisms are there, how many different insects are there, how many different animals are there, how many different plants are there. So you can imagine, so there is a diversity of living forms. So that is only is called as biodiversity. And there are about 10 million species in the planet. So in our planet, the Earth, there are 10 million species. So scientific names are given to 1.7 million species only. So the binomial name, the scientific names were given to only 1.7 million species. So these 10 million species that are not identified. The remaining ones other than these, the other organisms are the unidentified organisms. And out of these 1.7 million species, out of these 2 million are insects. So in this 10 million, 1.7 million species were given scientific names, and insects around, there are 2 million varieties on the earth. So you can imagine how many varieties of insects alone. 2 million means, imagine the plants, animals and other birds. So there are many types of organisms. In the aquatic also we have a number of organisms that are still unidentified. So these are the things under biodiversity. So in the next class you will be learning about biodiversity in detail. And now I will give you a short recap from the first. In this board we saw the purpose of the classification, that is it makes the study of wide variety of organisms. Using classification we can learn many varieties of organisms, and it helps in understanding the phylogeny, that is how the organism has evolved, what are the evolutionary history of the organism. So those things we can learn using classification of any organism. And it provides knowledge about origin, how the organism originated, and the genetic relationship. So whether it is related to any other organism. So those also can be considered. About all these things, knowledge we get, that is origin and genetic relationship among organisms. Then next is, it supplies vital information to all the branches of biology. It gives all the types of knowledge, information, that is about the history of the organism, or whether the group of the organism that is related to. So all the information are given using classification. Then by study, we can study single animal also, the information is got, and whether it is about a single plant also, the information is got. Whether you want to learn it as a group also, we can get it from the classification. So classification provides general information about all the organisms. And next we saw biodiversity. Biodiversity means diversity of life forms. And there are 10 billion species in the planet. And scientific names are given to only 1.7 billion species out of this 10 million. And insects alone, there are 2 million insects are there on the earth. These are the varieties of insects that are present, that is 2 million.
The next topic is hierarchy of classification. So, what is hierarchy? Hierarchy means it is a system of classification in which all the categories, different categories of the taxonomy. So, what is taxonomy? Those which are used to classify something which is related to classification is known as taxonomy. So, these classification have been divided into different categories. So, arranging those categories based on some logical sequence, arranging them orderly is known as hierarchy of classification. So, we were talking about taxonomic categories. So, arranging all the taxonomic categories according to some order is known as hierarchy. What are those categories? What are those taxonomic categories means? Those different categories that we are going to see now. So the first one is species. So species means it is the most lowest category of the living organism and it is the most basic unit of classification. Species includes a group of individuals, any group of similar individuals. They will be similar in structure and as well as function. So, for example, we can take a hibiscus flower. So, if you see that hibiscus flower means a set of a bunch of hibiscus, 10 or 12 hibiscus flower we are taking. So, if you see means the external structure also will be similar and internal function also it will be similar. So, these hibiscus, those are looking similar. They are put under one species. We will take human beings. We are all more or less similar. We have two hands, we have two legs, we have two eyes. Structure wise, we are similar, and the function also is similar inside it. So, what happens? We are all putting under one species. So, a group of individuals who is having a same structure and same function is known as species. And the second one is genus. Genus means it is a group of closely related species with common ancestors. So in genus, they are putting similar species. They may be related. For example, we can take hibiscus flower itself. In that itself, we have color variation. White we have, yellow we have. So the red we have. So red is one type of species, and yellow is one type of species, and white hibiscus is one type of species. So we are putting those three different species under one group that is called as genus. So it is a group of closely related species with a common ancestor. For example, in the book they have given potato and brinjal. So they are having common ancestors. They have some similarities. So they are put under the same genus. I have already told you about the binomial nomenclature. So there we are using two names, species name and the genera name. Genera name is nothing but the genus name. So here the potato and brinjal, they have the same genus called Solanum. Even though they are different species, but the genus name will be for potato and brinjal, it will be Solanum. Okay. So next is family. So family means a group of genus is taken and they have some common characters. The genus who have some common characters, they are together put under one family. And next is order. So in order what they will do, a number of families which have common characters. Those family which have common characters are taken and placed under uh, an order. So for example, Ursida is nothing but it is the family of bears. Canidae, it is the family of dogs and wolves. And Felidae, it is the family of cats, tigers, etc. So these bear family, the dog wolf family, and cats tiger family, these three are put together in one order called carnivora. So this is an example. Even though they are different, some characteral similarities are there. So these are being taken together and put under one order called carnivora. So the next is class. So similar orders, they are placed under one class. And next is phylum. So many classes with some common characters, they are put under one phylum. And finally, kingdom. So it is the highest category of taxonomic studies. So as you can see in the image, the kingdom is the first category of the whole classification. It is the highest category. So all the animals are put under one kingdom called Animalia, and all the plants are put under one kingdom called Plantae. Only two major kingdoms are there. One is Animalia and Plantae. And under that only different organisms are being placed. So this is all about the hierarchy of classification. And you can see the image. First the domain is there, and below that kingdom and phylum, class, order, family, genus and species. So this is the exact order of the hierarchy of classification. Any organism that are to be classified, it will be placed in this order only.
So I think you would have got an idea about what is classification and what are the different types of classification, their advantages, disadvantages, and about the purpose of the classification, and finally an introduction about biodiversity. So if you have any doubts, you can ask me in the Zoom meet. A worksheet will be given to you children. So learn all the answers properly, learn all the spellings, write it in your note and submit the homework. Take a picture and submit in your WhatsApp group. Thank you children.